In this last video on the Reagan Revolution, we'll look at the election of 1984 and Reagan's second term and the problems that he encountered there. As the 84 election approached, former Carter Vice President and Minnesota Senator Walter Mondale defeated several challengers for the Democratic nomination, including the civil rights activist Jesse Jackson and the Colorado Senator Gary Hart. In an historic decision, he selected New York Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential running mate. And it was historic because it was the first time a woman had ever been on a major party ticket. Mondale ran as an unabashed liberal, arguing about how Reaganomics was so unfair and hurt the poor. But Reagan now had a booming economy to claim, and he kind of touted this in a television ad that it really hit upon the themes of patriotism and the booming economy. He called it Morning in America, it was traditional values, America was great again, and all that. For its part, the Mondale campaign suffered from accusations that Ferraro's husband was involved in petty organized crime. The only hiccup in the campaign for Reagan was his attempt to use the popular Bruce Springsteen song Born in the USA, but the liberal Springsteen objected and Reagan had to stop. In a debate, Mondale tried to make an issue of Reagan's age, which at 73 would have made him the oldest president if re-elected. Reagan smartly deflected the criticism by saying that he would not make age an issue in the election because he didn't want to exploit his opponent's youth and inexperience. With the national debt growing in real terms and as a political issue, Mondale admitted that if elected, he would have to raise taxes. He said, "Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you, I just did." This is a quote that he would later come to regret. The 1984 election was one of the most lopsided in American history. Reagan won with 525 electoral college votes to Mondale's 13. Democrats held on to their control of the House of Representatives, which they'd had for a number of years, but they lost 16 seats. Many people thought that Mondale's admission that tax increases might be necessary cost them the election. And, in the years that followed, members of both parties took from this that a political lesson, that candidates must never, ever say that they think additional taxes are necessary. And ever since, no presidential candidate in the campaign has come out and said it. Despite Reagan's landslide win in 1984, his administration faced more struggles in his second term. The debt was still exploding, and people, demands were growing for the government. Hey, do something about it. And Reagan and the Democrats ended up reaching an agreement. It was a compromise tax reform legislation, just as significant or even more significant than Reagan's initial 1981 tax cuts. It was called the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and it really brought sweeping changes to the tax code itself. This Tax Reform Act reduced the number of marginal income tax rates from 14 to 2. And while it lowered the marginal rate for the wealthiest Americans to only 33%, it also eliminated many deductions and loopholes, ensuring additional revenue. So the tax code became a lot simpler, but there were a lot less deductions and loopholes that the rich people had exploited. The capital gains tax was increased, and the burden on corporations grew. Reagan argued that he had not raised taxes, and he was correct technically in looking at the individual marginal rates. But with all the loopholes and deductions closed and with the raises in the corporate tax rates, in fact, the nation's total tax burden had grown with the Tax Reform Act of '86. In his second term, Reagan continued his overtures to social conservatives. His Attorney General, Ed Meese, launched a war on pornography that critics argued violated civil liberties. And on the right here, you can see the final report of the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography. By his second term, Reagan was receiving increasing criticism for not speaking out more forcibly on the spread of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, aka AIDS. Caused by the virus HIV, the lethal infection was spread by body fluids and had first grown in the gay community. While it had become a great issue by the early 1980s, Reagan only mentioned it for the first time in 1985, and then it was briefly. And then again, not until 1987 when he twice mentioned it. And critics maintained that, he didn't want to anger his social conservative base. and that his slow reaction and poor funding caused additional death. Reagan's Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, however, spoke more frankly on the need for protected sex. In the 1986 off-year congressional elections, the Democrats rebounded big time, and they took the Senate, and that gave them control of both houses of Congress. This Congress, from 1986 to 88, was the 100th Congress, and it was led by the Democratic Speaker of the House, Jim Wright of Texas. Wright proved troublesome for Reagan, essentially ending any further hopes of advancing Reaganomics. And here on the right, you can see the seats that they lost in the House and the Senate by the year, the arrow pointing to 1986. The new power of the Democrats was evident when another Supreme Court vacancy arose. Reagan nominated the arch-conservative Robert Bork. Now, Bork had argued against established Supreme Court precedents on civil rights and abortions, and liberals fought him bitterly. In a highly personal and ugly confirmation battle, Democrats were able to defeat Bork's nomination. It was, arguably, the beginning of a highly partisan court nominations process that, of course, is so common today. Republicans spoke of personal attacks as being, quote, borked, unquote. Reagan followed with another nomination, Douglas Ginsburg, who was derailed by accusations of past marijuana use. Reagan eventually settled on Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy was more moderate in his judicial conservatism. In any event, Reagan's large number of nominations had moved the Supreme Court away from the broad interpretation of the Constitution favored by the New Deal and Great Society justices previously. And yet another problem, the stock market suffered its greatest one-day drop since the Great Depression on October 19, 1987, so-called Black Monday. And you can see the Dow Jones Industrial Average on the graph here on the left and how much it fell. The stock market had grown beyond the true value of the companies it represented, and a strong dollar had hurt exports. But the real cause of the crash was computerized trading, where algorithms automatically sold stocks when prices had dropped to a certain point. The result was a cycle of selling. The Federal Reserve stepped in to add liquidity to the economy, making it easier to get money, and the crash fortunately didn't kick the economy into a major recession. Nevertheless, in the final 2 years of the Reagan presidency, the economy didn't grow at the same robust rate it had earlier. There were still other problems in Reagan's second term, including the so-called savings and loans crisis in 1987 and the late 80s. Deregulation had allowed these financial institutions to hide from their depositors the losses they'd suffered from declining oil and land prices. Now, overextended in their loans and facing bankruptcy, there was a run on this type of bank, and the federal government eventually, in the coming years, had to bail them out with well over $100 billion. As a sidebar, just after Reagan left office in 1989, the savings and loan crisis led to the Keating 5 scandal. 5 senators were accused of intervening to protect a troubled savings and loan run by Charles Keating, who was a big campaign contributor to the 5. The scandal demonstrated the role of money in American politics. I am going to sort of conclude this last video with kind of where I began the first one. When Reagan left office, he'd arguably transformed American politics and governance. The era of dominant liberalism since World War II, where people had optimistic faith in government, had ended, and Reagan signified the emergence of a more conservative era in which people distrusted government. Reagan's legacy was immense, and in the years that followed, his more skeptical view of government was in its ascendancy. In addition, he helped mold the modern Republican Party as an alliance between fiscal and social conservatives, as I've said before, the so-called New Right. For all these reasons, Reagan is idolized by conservative Republicans today. And one last addendum, in his last decade of life before his death in 2004, Reagan suffered from Alzheimer's disease and became a symbol of the fight against that tragic disease. On the left here, you can see a letter that he had scribbled announcing his diagnosis. In any event, this concludes the videos on Reagan and Reaganomics.